Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, January 8th, 2024. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you had an awesome weekend. And today I've got a nullification movement status report. There's a bunch of legislation that's already been filed in states for the 2024 legislative session to treat gold and silver as money. We're talking about ending the Federal Reserve from the bottom up. So treating gold and silver as money rather than as a mere investment vehicle to be taxed, as they should have been doing all along. And even a growing number of states who are considering bills to reject a CBDC, central bank digital currency, and money as money. I'll get to all that in just a moment. But first, I want to start with a foundation here from Lysander Spooner in his great essay on the trial by jury from 1852. And here's how Spooner put it. Discussion can do nothing to prevent the enactment or procure the repeal of unjust laws, unless it be understood that the discussion is to be followed by resistance. And Spooner really hammers home what I'm trying to get at here, and maybe he'll do better than I can do. He said, tyrants care nothing for discussions that are to end only in discussion. Discussions which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them. So while we can post and yell and have signs that say, end the Fed until the end of time, it's not going to end the Fed unless the people and the states actually do something to interfere with the free-flowing operation of their fiat funny money system that comes out of the Federal Reserve, which never should have existed in the first place. And it's not just Spooner. Here's James Iredell, who I've cited many times. He was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. And in the North Carolina ratifying convention in 1788, he put it this way. He said, the only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So ultimately, the only way to stop anything coming out of Washington, D.C. is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise, not going to the government in the hopes that the government is going to limit the power of itself. Congress is never going to cut off its printing press, and the Federal Reserve will never end itself. Well, how do you do that? How do the people prevent its exercise? James Madison told us in Federalist number 46. He said, for states and individuals, you have to use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, and for states, use legislative devices to help kind of implement or effectuate that approach. I've covered this in some detail in a previous episode of this show just this last year, September 20th, Nullify the Fed. You can find that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And there I cover the 5 main steps that need to be taken by states, 4 of them primarily by states, and then the most important one by individuals. We're talking about recognizing gold and silver as legal tender, establishing depositories, remove taxes, authorizing reserves, and of course, human action, which I'll get back to in just a moment. So if you want to learn more about that, you'll want to check out this Nullify the Fed episode, which we'll have linked to in the show notes for today. So with that as our foundation, let's look at some of the top legislation that we're tracking here in the nullification season for 2024, supporting sound money, rejecting the Federal Reserve, kind of getting in the way. These are first steps, but they can be big ones, getting in the way of the operation of the fiat money system. And first of all, I want to go to New Hampshire, because tomorrow in New Hampshire, House Bill 1674 is getting its first committee hearing. In New Hampshire, the process is very unusual in comparison to other states. Every bill gets a hearing in committee, every bill gets voted on in committee, and every bill, whether the committee approves it or not, gets voted on in the House. But really what you want to see have happen, if you're an activist living in New Hampshire, you want the committee to give the bill an ought to pass, OTP recommendation, because a lot of times there's so many bills that the House is just doing voice vote and they're voting in bulk. They're probably not really paying attention unless there's a lot of activity surrounding a piece of legislation. And if the committee says no, ought not to pass, they generally just kind of throw it away and it never goes anywhere, although there are some exceptions to that. But anyways, tomorrow in New Hampshire, a first hearing on House Bill 1674, which would make gold and silver legal tender in the state, as they always should have treated it. And here from a report by Mike Meharry, he said, practically speaking, these provisions would allow New Hampshireites to use gold or silver in both physical and electronic form as money, rather than just as a mere investment vehicle, because government loves treating gold and silver. They love treating real money as an investment tool, as property that they can tax and control, because then you're not using it as money and you're having to rely on their fiat system. In effect, this would put gold and silver on the same footing, according to the government there, as Federal Reserve notes. We know that there is no equality between the two. And Mike continues, he said, passage into law would make New Hampshire the 5th state to recognize gold and silver as legal tender. Utah led the way in 2011 as reestablishing constitutional money, followed by Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Now, there's a little bit more to this legislation in New Hampshire. It would also include provisions to specifically exclude gold and silver bullion from taxation. Because if it's money, as Ron Paul said in support of a similar piece of legislation in Arizona a few years ago, we ought not to tax money. If you think of the idea, the example that Meharry often gives is, let's say you go to a store and you want to make some change and you bring them a gold back. We'll just say it's a $5 gold back. And you want to get some singles, some fiat garbage, and you make an exchange, and then they say, well, we got to charge you a 35-cent tax. This is a way that government discourages the use of gold and silver as money. Of course, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So it includes some provisions to exclude silver and gold bullion from taxation. It shall not, this is from the legislation, it shall not be characterized as personal property for taxation or regulatory purposes. The exchange of one form of legal tender for another shall not give rise to any tax liability, and the purchase or sale of any type or form of bullion shall not give rise to any tax liability whatsoever. That's an important part to get out of the way as well, because as long as government continues to tax this, people will be less likely to use it as money. And Mike says, in a nutshell, we also have that the legislation is going to establish a depository should it pass. And he says, in a nutshell, through the depository, New Hampshireites would eventually be able to deposit gold and silver and pay other people through electronic means. So they want to set up a payment system so people can actually use it as money in day-to-day transactions. Mike continues, private individuals and entities would be able to purchase goods and services using assets in the vault the same way they use cash and a debit card today. And doing so has the potential to open the market to sound money in day-to-day transactions. And now ultimately, it's about giving people an option. If you get a lot of the government garbage out of the way, and you say, well, yes, this is now legal. I mean, even though we shouldn't have to rely on government telling people to do that, we've seen how this has played out in regards to cannabis, of course. Before any state, like here in California back in 1996, actually told the people, yeah, it's okay, you can do this. People were buying, selling, consuming, growing, etc. this plant that all governments said were illegal. But once you actually, the state says, now everybody can do it. It actually opens the door, or gets a foot in the door for the market. We know, or at least my position is that markets are stronger than governments. And all you have to do is open up the door to more of the people, more of the mainstream people who are maybe not as interested in flouting the system and going the gray market approach. And then it just keeps expanding from there. But Mike continues. He said, by making gold and silver available for regular daily transactions by the general public, the depository has the potential for wide-reaching effect. Professor William Green, who passed away a few years ago, he said he was an expert on constitutional tender and said in a paper for the Mises Institute that when people in multiple states actually start using gold and silver instead of Federal Reserve notes, it can effectively nullify the Federal Reserve and end the federal government's monopoly on money. The only reason there is a monopoly on money is because people are still using the fiat trash. As long as people continue using the government money, the Federal Reserve money, the paper garbage, or a central bank digital currency, it's never going to go away. So this is just about giving people an option. And then as more people do this, then more people become interested. And that's what our, I wish I had, I do have a membership card. On our membership cards, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, there's a Latin phrase, Concordia res parve crescunt. This comes from John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. It means small things grow great by concord. And we really believe in that here because the penman of the Revolution was right in 1767, and small things did grow great by concord. Every small step can lead to another if we have the fortitude and perseverance to keep pushing forward. So New Hampshire House Bill 1674 is up for a hearing. Its first hearing tomorrow. And if you want to read that full paper by William Green, Ending the Federal Reserve from the Bottom Up, he presented this at the Mises Institute some years ago, but it's very interesting. That will be linked to in the show notes as well. Then also we have in Missouri, Senate Bill 735. And this report by Meharry says the legislation would take steps to treat gold and silver as money in Missouri and encourage its use as such, including making it legal tender, eliminating state capital gains tax on the sale of gold and silver. And then it also includes provisions authorizing the state to invest in gold and silver greater than or equal to 1% of all state funds. So a small amount of state funds could be invested in gold and silver. We saw something like this pass in Tennessee last year. And this is actually an interesting thing that I hadn't thought of until the last few years, where, yeah, you want to be able to have states have a hedge against, well, whatever coming chaos might happen in the monetary system. So this does multiple things in Missouri, and there are 3 to 4. There's a lot of pressure from a lot of great Missouri activists. I think they're doing a door knocking to get co-sponsors at the Capitol tomorrow. The Missouri Freedom Initiative is who you want to follow on that one. Senate Bill 735, but there's also House Bill, I think, 1955, maybe 3-4 other pieces of legislation in Missouri to treat gold and silver as money, again, rather than just a mere investment vehicle to be taxed and controlled by government. In Indiana, we have the Legal Tender Act. House Bill 1043 was just filed. The legislative session, I believe, starts today, so it was pre-filed this last week by Representative Cindy Ledbetter. This is very similar to the Missouri bill. We also have in Florida, similar to the New Hampshire bill with the depository attached on there as well, House Bill 697 and Senate Bill 750. And what I find most interesting about both Indiana and Florida considering bills to treat gold and silver as legal tender is this last year, Indiana and then Florida became the first states to pass a law that expressly removes a central bank digital currency, or CBDC, from the definition of money within the state under the state's Uniform Commercial Code. I have a link to the report here for Indiana, now in effect. Indiana law bans use of CBDC as money in the state. I mean, people, if they want to use it, they're going to find a way to do it. But this is about throwing up roadblocks, making it more difficult to implement. And Mike Meharry in his report on that Indiana law covers how that might play out, because we really don't know. This is new ground. They haven't even done this yet. We know they probably want to do it. This is another way that they can ramp up the control of the monetary system. So the more that states say, we aren't going to play along, the better. The harder it will be for them to get that done. And I keep mentioning the show notes. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. A couple hours after this live stream is done, we will publish a blog post for this episode like we do for every single episode. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley will get all the links that I'm mentioning. I'm talking about different pieces of legislation, Spooner's essay on the trial by jury, James Iredell's speech in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. All that stuff will be linked to in the show notes, plus all the different platforms that we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube, Facebook, X. We also live stream at Rumble and Odyssey. We've been live streaming at TikTok now off and on for the last week. I'm not sure if I got to work on improving the quality of what's going on there, but doing some test runs to see if we can reach and teach more people over on TikTok as well. Plus, we also have all the different platforms that we're audio-only podcast edition, where actually most of the people listen to the show. Whatever platform you're on, I really appreciate you being here. Again, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty is where that's going to be for the blog post for this episode and every single episode, especially if you live in one of these states where I'm mentioning legislation. You want to pull up that bill and you want to share it. You want to share the report with as many people as possible. And of course, you want to take action and support. And I'll get to that on some things that you can do in support as well in just a moment. So we're talking about, first of all, some legal tender legislation to treat gold and silver as money, plus some steps about rejecting a CBDC that have already happened. And we see how Indiana and Florida are taking legislation or considering legislation to now take action on gold and silver, where they already took steps on a CBDC. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, Utah was the first state in 2011 to recognize gold and silver as money. With the Specie Legal Tender Act, they've expanded a number of times. We've now seen United Precious Metals Association, basically like an outside the Federal Reserve System gold bank, which has been established, and even the Goldback, which is really physical, spendable gold money. Well, we don't want to call it money because the feds don't like that, but whatever. Barter notes in gold and silver over at goldback.com. So they became the first to do this as far as gold and silver, and it's having a lot of effect, a lot of impact in Utah. We see a lot of retailers, at least small businesses, starting to accept gold and silver as money, and I think there's a strong grassroots effort to support that there as well, but it's probably going to spread. The more that this happens, the more that people learn where their value actually is, and it's definitely not in Federal Reserve trash. So now with House Bill 164, which was just filed in Utah, they want to amend the Specie Legal Tender Act to expressly ban a central bank digital currency as money within the state. And here from the report by Mike Meharry, it would specify that, quote, a central bank digital currency is not specie legal tender and is not legal tender in the state. And that effectively would exclude a central bank digital currency from the state's definition of money under the Utah Specie Legal Tender Act, which has been around now for almost 13 years, and the state's Uniform Commercial Code, or the UCC. So that's House Bill 164 in Utah to expressly remove central bank digital currency preemptively from being considered money within the state. In Wisconsin, there's Assembly Bill 725. That legislation would also expressly exclude a CBDC from the definition of money, but it would also prohibit state agencies from accepting a CBDC as a form of payment. Now, some people might be saying, well, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. But to be honest with you, I'm totally fine with government shooting themselves in the foot. And the more that there are roadblocks to being able to implement and use a central bank digital currency, the less likely we'll ever see it forced upon us. And ultimately, again, it's going to get down to the people. So Wisconsin Assembly Bill 725 would not only remove a central bank digital currency preemptively from the definition of money within the state, but it would also prohibit all state agencies from accepting a CBDC in any form of payment. South Carolina has a bill, Senate Bill 861 from Senator Shane Martin, which was pre-filed for this session last November. Senate Bill 861 expressly removes central bank digital currency from the definition of money, just like the laws passed in Indiana and Florida. And then in Missouri, this would, again, also expressly remove central bank digital currency from the definition of money. I'm going to be saying this over and over and over throughout 2024 because it's really important stuff. But Meharry reports that the legislation would go a step further than other states with a provision to prohibit a state or local government from accepting CBDC as payment, just like the legislation in Wisconsin. But it would also prohibit any public entity from participating in a test of a central bank digital currency by the Federal Reserve. Because we know they start out the process by doing some testing systems. And they're saying, we're not even going to participate in that. We're not going to participate in it. We're not going to accept it as money. And it's not going to be considered money under the state Uniform Commercial Code. That's House Bill 16. Oh, no, that is, what is the legislation? Senate Bill 826. I guess there's also a similar one in the House from Mark Matheson. I'm not familiar with him, but that's House Bill 1676 in Missouri. And then there's a couple of other bills regarding gold and silver as legal tender, just very straightforward, not trying to cover too much ground in a single piece of legislation. I actually prefer that strategy. I know the New Hampshire bill is addressing gold and silver as legal tender, removing taxes, establishing a depository. In my experience, trying to do a lot in a single piece of legislation can be kind of detrimental strategically because the more you try to do, the more reasons or the excuses they have to say no to it, but maybe they can get the pressure. They just passed the Defend the Guard out of the House this week, only the second legislative chamber in the country to do that in modern times. So maybe we got some good grassroots support to pull that off, but it can also be a negotiating tool. If you start out high and you say, okay, well, we got all this stuff in this legislation, and you're okay with this and this, but maybe we can use this as a negotiating tool and then file that as a follow-up piece of legislation in the future. We saw this happen with the Utah Specie Legal Tender Act in 2011. They actually added all kinds of provisions to it over the years to expand its impact, remove taxation, make sure that the gold back wasn't treated as something to be taxed as well. So in Tennessee, they're looking at legislation, House Bill 1481 from Brad Hulsey, And from Frank Nicely on the Senate side, Senate Bill 311 would treat gold and silver as money. Again, there are already 4 states that are doing this: Utah, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and then Arkansas was most recent in 2023 to treat gold and silver as legal tender. There's also some other bills that are being considered in Alaska, House Bill 3, South Carolina, House Bill 3080. So if you live in any of these states and you're in support of this kind of thing, of course you want to take action and support. I might as well mention what you should really be doing. What you want to do is you want to call your state senator and your state representative. Tell them who you are, where you live, whether if you like them or not. Just call them, be polite, be firm, professional, but polite, because being a jerk absolutely does not work. We've seen in some situations where people have basically just called and really just kind of hammered on the people on the phone. And even if they were previously in support of something, they're just like, they're human beings. So the nicer you treat them, the better chance you'll have of getting them to listen. But don't be a wimp about it. Still be very firm. I support House Bill 1481 in Tennessee. I would like to see you co-sponsor and support this. You can also look up through the legislation. In every one of these reports, you can click through the bill and you can look and see the status of that on the state legislative website or on legiscans.com. That way you can see what committee is in, and you should call all the committee members and tell them you want them to vote yes on the bill. Again, a phone call does way more, has way more impact than any kind of email or anything like that. So a phone call, actually showing up and knocking on their doors like they're going to do in Missouri again, that has the most impact, but very few people have the capacity to do that. If you can, a trip to the Capitol with a group of 5 or 10 people can have a lot of impact and get a lot of co-sponsors. Missouri Freedom Initiative has been doing great work on that in Missouri for a number of years. So Tennessee, House Bill 1481, Alaska, House Bill 3, South Carolina, 3080. And then Oklahoma, they've got a follow-up to their legislation that was signed into law to treat gold and silver as money, but it hasn't had much impact there. And I haven't really studied the reason why. For some reason, things aren't being really implemented in Oklahoma. So maybe this bill, Senate Bill 1507 from Shane Jett, will help out. It would eliminate capital gains taxes on gold and silver species. So one of the problems that happens in this type of scenario, if you buy some gold, let's say you buy $1,000 worth of gold a month ago, and now today it's worth $1,200, and you want to go and spend that. As soon as you do that, if the state has capital gains taxes on it, they're going to actually treat that as 2 transactions. One, even if you find a retailer to accept it at $1,200, the state is going to say, well, you bought it at $1,000 and now you're selling it at $1,200. You aren't using it to purchase. You're basically selling it. So we're going to tax you capital gains on that $200. So maybe this is an important part of that. They would remove that capital gains tax in Oklahoma for Senate Bill 1507. And Meharry reports that they've got some clarification on the definition of gold and silver as legal tender in the state. I haven't studied the piece of legislation too closely, but we are following that one as well. And then in Oklahoma, Senate Bill 1351 would create the Oklahoma Bullion Depository. There's already one established in Texas, and then the privately run and operated United Precious Metals Association, or Alpine Exchange in Utah, does something like this, operating similar to like a gold bank. And Mike says, significantly in Oklahoma, Senate Bill 1351 would establish a mechanism for individuals to exchange in transactions using precious metals, including gold and silver. That's a big part of it. If you want to treat gold and silver as money, you have to make it easier for people to use rather than carrying around a bar in their pocket. They need to be able to make the transactions when they go to the grocery store. If they have a debit card that can automatically do the conversion and make that payment, and then it doesn't even require the other side to be on board yet either. But that's another question for another time. And here from the legislation, Senate Bill 1351, the depository shall make available a debit card issued upon a request by the depository account holder, in which the holder may make transactions which are debited from the balance of the holder's account. So this would have provisions in it as well to actually facilitate the use of gold and silver as money in the state, rather than just saying, okay, you can do this. And here in Tennessee, Senate Bill 1150, very similar, but they also have a provision in that legislation to establish a depository that specifically says it could be run by the state, but it could also be operated privately under the statute. And this one also has a provision that would open the door for people to use precious metals stored in the depository in everyday transactions. I think that's the most important part, is encouraging people to use something, anything. Honestly, I'm talking about gold and silver, but there's all kinds of cryptocurrencies, whatever anybody wants to use that is not fiat money, that is not the US dollar. That is absolute garbage. I mean, we'll take it here, of course, and we're going to spend it fighting against the Federal Reserve and the entire empire, the largest government in the history of the world. But the more that people start using alternatives to the government-supported, government-backed system that comes out of the Federal Reserve, the less likely it will be able to stay the top of the heap for a long, long time. So we're also tracking a number of bills on various issues around this, whether it's removing taxes. In New Jersey, there's a piece of legislation of all places. New Jersey is not a place where you ever see taxes get repealed or removed, but there's a piece of legislation there. I don't have the bill number off the top of my head here, but it already passed the Assembly to remove taxes on gold and silver bullion, and it's in the full Senate for final consideration there as well. But we're following similar legislation like that in Wisconsin and Kentucky, and then a smaller step against the CBDC in Nebraska. And this is really just scratching the surface. I know I'm ripping through a ton of bill numbers and stuff like that today, but this is just scratching the surface. The state legislative sessions really just started in the last week, and so things are just getting underway. A vast majority of states are still filing bills for 2024, so we're probably going to see at least double this amount of legislation considered in support of sound money, rejecting central bank digital currency, and some other stuff along those lines to take on the Federal Reserve. And again, the action steps, if you want to be involved and informed, you can do a few things. 10thamendmentcenter.com/register. We send out email updates all the time on what's going on in state legislation, especially this time of year. We send all kinds of interesting articles and videos as well. But if you want to take action steps and keep up to date with what's going on, 10thamendmentcenter.com/register. But you definitely want to do what I was mentioning before. Make some phone calls in the state where you live in support of this kind of legislation. If a bill has already been filed, just tell your state's representative, state senator, hey, I want you to support and co-sponsor this bill. Call the committee members. If nothing's been filed, say, here's one that I'm interested in from New Hampshire. Could you please file something similar for our state? And the more that people do this, I know sometimes it seems almost insurmountable to convince these people to do the right things, but it can actually have some impact as well in a positive way. But even more important than all these bills is human action, because it doesn't matter how many states say we're going to treat gold and silver as money. If everybody continues using the US dollar, it doesn't change anything. So ultimately, human action by the people is the most important thing that has to happen. And the more that states get roadblocks out of the way, the more likely we'll see this play out in a positive way. This is, again, we see how this happened in response to cannabis prohibition. It's still happening today. And a number of years ago, I pointed out that the more that states actually legalize what the federal government says they can't do, and we can do the opposite way as well, the more that states take these types of action, the more that people will start doing what the feds don't want them to do, the less likely the feds will ever be able to continue their prohibition scheme. And eventually what we'll see is they're going to back off just to save face. And I don't think that's super close today, because we hear a lot about legislation in Congress to say, okay, well, they're going to decriminalize or they're going to reschedule, whatever it may be. And it never seems to happen. But eventually when it does, it's only happening because the people and the states said no first, and it only became politically viable to make the change after that. And now nothing helps us do this kind of work, get the information out to more and more people, and actually do the action alerts in support of this type of activity more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us with a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, lifetime, and 5-year options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And I do want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us as members lately. I can't thank you enough. There's Neffy in Utah, Jason in Vermont, Brian in Minnesota, Andrew in California, Jewel in Oregon, and Juanita in Texas. thank you all so much for putting your financial faith behind our work. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if I've got any comments or questions that I can get back to. David Santiago, the first thing I see is the Fed is a racket. Without a doubt, man, that is one of the biggest scams ever is the Federal Reserve. Senator DT says, Michael, you are outstanding. Keep up the good work. I am lucky to have a great supporting team putting together all this stuff so I could just blab about it and share the information with you. But it does take a lot of work. Absolute Defiance says, move to New Hampshire, of course, referencing the Free State Project. The more that people, like-minded people, can concentrate in one area, the more they can get stuff done. And I love the Free State Project. So that's probably freestateproject.org. I know if you just Google them, you'll definitely find it. It is still true if you pay for your home or land in gold in full, then you can obtain the patent. I don't know anything about that. That house is lost, tribe. I love comments like this, especially when I know absolutely nothing about it, because sometimes it gets me to start doing some more research. It gives me more work on my plate, but I appreciate that feedback as well. Rudolph Cohn, awesome comment here on YouTube. Always remember the feds have almost no power if states refuse to cooperate, especially if we're talking about states and the people refusing to participate. When we're talking about the Federal Reserve, again, they can print all the dollars they want. They can print all of the dollars, and if no one uses them, then it doesn't really, they don't really have the additional power that they want. So we have to learn how to exercise our rights and do the right thing, whether the government likes it or not, and they certainly do not. Anyways, I'll look over in the chat a little bit more later today. I appreciate the feedback. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. That gives me a lot of great ideas for future episodes. And I really appreciate your input and support. You can also do a few other things if you want to help us spread the word. Smash the like button, leave a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform. Subscribe, get notifications, all that stuff can help trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and show us to more people. I really appreciate your support. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you are going to take some action in support of this type of legislation and, of course, using something other than the U.S. dollar for payments as often as possible. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.